long after the men are gone and the ship's reduced to rust and coral. The Pacific keeps its secrets beneath a skin of light, but some stories refuse to stay buried. One of them begins on a November night in 1942, off a small jungle-covered island whose name would come to symbolize both endurance and sacrifice. Guadalcanal. That autumn, the Pacific War was finally balanced on a knife's edge. Japan had surged across half an ocean in the first months of war, but the United States was learning fast, improvising, adapting, and bleeding its way toward parity. On land, the Marines clung to a half-finished airfield carved from the island's red clay. At sea, the struggle for its control raged every few nights in sudden, violent flashes of gunfire. It was the age of the night battle, of torpedoes and searchlights, of ships firing blind into darkness. Among those ships was a sleek, gray destroyer, 341 feet of American engineering named USS Preston. She was one of the Mayan class, products of the 1930s Navy, fast, heavily armed, and built on the faith that speed and daring could compensate for light armor. She had spent the inner warriors in training cruises and maneuvers, the kind of quiet routine that could make war feel theoretical. Her crew loved her lines and her speed. She could turn inside almost anything afloat. When she left Pearl Harbor in mid-1942, she carried a sense of purpose and confidence that the Pacific still belonged to be mastered. By November, Preston was part of Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, a formation built around two new battleships, Washington and South Dakota, and for destroyers acting as eyes and shields. Their assignment was straightforward in writing and deadly in practice. Intercepted Japanese force racing south to shell Henderson Field. The men aboard knew what that meant. Every night that the airfield survived, American bombers could fly at dawn. Every night it fell silent, Japanese troops advanced unopposed. Control of one dirt runway would decide the fate of the campaign. As the sun dipped behind a curtain of tropical cloud on November 14th, the ship steamed in silence through the long channel of water that cut between the Solomon Islands. The weather was heavy, the moon hidden, the air thick with heat and the smell of oil and metal. Somewhere out there, unseen but certain, the enemy was coming. On the bridge, Commander Max C. Storms studied the radar screen, a new marvel of technology that painted ghostly blips of light across the dark. It was temperamental, but it offered a chance to see first, to strike first. Shortly after 11 o'clock, the radar reported contact. Several large returns, range 20,000 yards, bearing west. They were closing fast. The men at the guns tightened their grips. Orders moved quietly down the line. Stand by to open fire. Below deck, in the fire rooms, engineers adjusted valves, feeling the vibrations of turbines ready to surge. One sailor later recalled the air humming like a coiled spring. Then came the first flashes on the horizon. Orange arcs tore through the night, Japanese searchlights probing the darkness. Within seconds, the Black Sea erupted into chaos. Preston's gunners answered, their 5-inch mounts barking flame. Shells screamed overhead, tracers stitched across the waves. For a few moments, the American formation held its line, exchanging fire with unseen shapes. What no one realized until too late was that the Japanese column included two battleships, Kirishima and Haruna. Their 14-inch guns outranged every destroyer afloat. When they fired, the sea itself seemed to shudder. One of those shells found Preston. The hit struck near her forward fire room, tearing open steel plating and showering scalding steam through the passageways. A second shell exploded amidships, where fuel lines and electrical cables ran close together. In an instant, power failed, lights died, and the ship was enveloped in darkness broken only by fire. Men stumbled through smoke, shouting for water, for air, for each other. Down below, the engineers fought to contain the blaze. They tried to close the valves to cut steam flow, but the heat was unbearable. Several never made it back up the ladders. Others were blown clear when a secondary explosion ripped through the compartment. On deck, sailors dragged the wounded toward the rail, the sky lit by tracer fire from every direction. Preston had been struck in the worst possible place. The blast severed internal bulkheads that were meant to contain flooding. Instead, they folded like paper. The destroyer's light construction and advantage in speed became her undoing. Within minutes, she began to list to port. Commander Storms realized she could not be saved. He gave the order to abandon ship. Those who could jumped. Some clung to rafts or splintered planks. Others simply floated in oil-slick water, praying to stay unseen as the battle raged around them. From their vantage point, they saw their ship burning bow to stern, a pillar of flame on the dark sea. Then, slowly, she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. The time was 11:36 p.m. when dawn came. The survivors found each other among patches of oil and debris. Destroyer USS Meade spotted them and moved in to pick them up. 72 of Preston's crew were gone, including Captain Storms. For the rest, the memory would never fade. The roar of explosions, the blinding light, the sudden silence when the ship was gone. Back at Tulagi, Navy doctors tended the burned and broken. Naval intelligence officers took statements, piecing together the final minutes of the ship's life. Among the rescued was a young engineering officer, Ensign Robert G. McHenry, who had joined the Navy barely a year earlier. He would later become one of the post-war naval architects tasked with analyzing why so many destroyers had been lost so quickly. At the time, though, he could only describe what he had seen. The ship didn't just sink. He wrote in a letter home, "She collapsed. It was as if the steel turned soft." The loss of Preston was one of many in that brutal campaign. Within 2 weeks, 6 American destroyers lay at the bottom near Guadalcanal. Each loss told the same story: massive damage from a few hits, rapid flooding, catastrophic fires. The Navy had trained its gunners and commanders well, but its engineers now faced questions that gunnery alone could not answer. Why did these ships fail so completely? Could design, not luck, decide survival? At the Bureau of Ships in Washington, analysts began to collect every report that filtered back from the Pacific. They studied fragments of steel recovered from damaged vessels, diagrams of penetration paths, eyewitness sketches of where the fires began. It was the first systematic attempt to learn from destruction on such a scale. Preston's data were among the earliest. Her loss became a case study in what engineers called progressive failure, a chain of small weaknesses that, once triggered, led to total collapse. The investigators found several recurring flaws. The first was structural. The lightweight high-tensile steel used in pre-war destroyers saved weight, but buckled under extreme shock. The second was layout. Boiler rooms placed too close together allowed a single hit to disable all propulsion. The third was stability. Added topside equipment, anti-aircraft guns, directors, extra lifeboats had raised the center of gravity. When water poured into lower compartments, capsizing was almost inevitable. To the designers of the 1930s, these compromises had been acceptable. The Navy had demanded speed above all. A destroyer needed to outrun submarines, chase carriers, escort convoys. Armor was a luxury. Agility was life. But Guadalcanal changed that calculus. Speed meant nothing if a single shell could end a ship. Meanwhile, the war pushed forward relentlessly. New destroyers were already sliding down the ways in shipyards at Bath Iron Works in Maine and at Federal Shipbuilding in New Jersey. The men drafting their blueprints worked from designs conceived before Pearl Harbor. Now, with fresh combat data arriving by courier, those blueprints began to evolve. Naval architects adjusted hull framing, added internal bulkheads, ray-rooted ventilation to prevent the spread of fire. Many of these modifications were small, a thicker plate here, an extra support beam there, but together they marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. In naval engineering, for families back home, those technical details meant little comfort. Telegrams bearing the words "missing in action" arrived in towns across the country. In Springfield, Ohio, Commander Storms's widow received hers 3 weeks before Christmas. Local newspapers ran his photograph with the headline "Hero of the Pacific." Few readers could have known that behind the headline lay a broader story: the birth of a new Navy. Forged from lost dot in early 1943, divers working with salvaged ships reached parts of Preston's resting place, a depth of over 200 fathoms near Savo Island. They brought up small pieces of wreckage, sections of pipe, fragments of deck plate, twisted fittings. To engineers, these were priceless artifacts. Each was measured, photographed, and catalogued. Metallurgists tested the steel for brittleness, comparing it to samples from surviving sister ships. They discovered microscopic fractures consistent with high-temperature shock, evidence that the metal itself had reached its limits under the heat of explosion. Those findings fed into the design of the next generation, the Allen M. Sumner-class destroyers, already on the drafting boards. The lessons were clear. Compartmentalization had to be improved. Boilers must be separated by heavier transverse bulkheads. Fire mains and power lines required redundant routing. Above all, the hull needed greater longitudinal strength to absorb the force of near-miss explosions. These were not glamorous adjustments, and few sailors would ever notice them, but they would save lives. By the time the war entered its final years, American destroyers were far tougher, more stable, and more forgiving than their predecessors. Each improvement traced, in part, back to ships like Preston. Looking back now, it is tempting to see inevitability in that evolution, to imagine that progress marches forward, no matter the cost. Yet the truth is less certain. Innovation in war is paid for in blood. Every weld, every recalculated frame, represented questions asked too late for the men who perished asking them. Today, the wreck of USS Preston rests more than 2,000 feet below the waves, her hull half buried in silt, her guns still pointing upward. Marine life has claimed her, coral blooming where paint once shone. But the blueprint she left behind endures. In every destroyer built since, from the steel giants of the Cold War to the stealth shapes of the present, echoes of that November night remain, lessons etched in metal. Whispered through generations of engineers, the sea keeps its memories, but it also grants them purpose. Out of the darkness of Guadalcanal rose a new understanding of what a ship could be. Not merely a weapon, but a living system, resilient, adaptable. Born from the failures of its ancestors, Preston's fall was the Navy's turning point. The moment when courage at the front met curiosity in the shipyard, and together they forged the path ahead. In the months that followed the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Pacific quieted only slightly. The ocean remained littered with the wrecks of ships that had fought their American, Japanese, and Allied alike, lying in uneven silence across the seabed. Yet even as the war raged elsewhere, the U.S. Navy turned its attention to these resting places. They were not merely graves. They were sources of data, repositories of answers to questions the Navy could no longer afford to ignore. At naval bases from Espiritu Santo to Pearl Harbor, teams of engineers, divers, and metallurgists began the slow, methodical work of studying what could be learned from ships like the Preston. Some of these men had once designed the very classes of destroyers now gone. Others were young recruits, fresh from engineering schools, eager to serve the war effort with their minds instead of their rifles. They understood that every broken girder, every twisted plate, was a kind of autopsy report written in steel dot in early 1943. Under the guidance of the Bureau of Ships, a new system was created, the War Damage Reports Program. Each sunken or heavily damaged vessel would be examined, diagrammed, and documented in full. Divers retrieved fragments whenever possible. Survivors were interviewed in detail about what they saw and heard before their ships went under. This process transformed tragedy into study, turning loss into the foundation of design reform. Among the first subjects was the Mayan class itself, the family of ships to which Preston had belonged. The reports were blunt. The class's high-pressure boilers and compact engine rooms, while efficient, created deadly chain reactions when struck. The lightweight framing that made them fast left them brittle under shell impact, and the compartment layout often sacrificed survivability for speed of access. The Navy's engineers had built these ships for the chase, not for the siege. The lessons from Guadalcanal spread quickly. Shipyards in Bath, Quincy, and San Francisco began implementing changes even before the ink on the reports dried. Steel plating on new destroyers thickened from 3/8 to half an inch in critical areas. Compartments were rearranged to provide more watertight separation between power plants. Fire mains were duplicated to run on both sides of the hull, ensuring that damage on one side would not cripple the entire system. These might seem like technical adjustments, but together they marked a philosophical shift. American shipbuilding was moving from speed-centered to survivability-centered design. The Navy's engineers also began to look more closely at the behavior of materials. Under combat stress, metallurgists discovered that certain grades of high-tensile steel, favored for their lightness, became brittle when repeatedly exposed to the tropical heat of the Pacific and the sudden cooling of seawater. The material cracked under pressure in ways not fully understood before the war. New formulas were developed, and production methods altered to temper the steel differently. These incremental improvements would eventually define the durability of the post-war fleet. At Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard, damaged destroyers limped home from the front lines, their hulls scarred and twisted. They became live classrooms for naval architects. Engineers crawled through buckled bulkheads with notebooks and rulers, measuring how much force had bent each beam, how the direction of the explosion correlated with the pattern of failure. Out of those observations came entire textbooks of wartime design data that no peacetime experiment could ever replicate. Yet the process was not only scientific, it was deeply human. Each report began with a list of the ship's company, the men who had lived and died in the compartments now under analysis. Engineers would often pause, reading those names aloud before beginning their diagrams. Many had served at sea themselves. For them, every pencil line on the page was a small act of remembrance, a promise that the next ship would be stronger because of the one that was lost. The Bureau of Ships soon realized it needed a centralized facility to process and preserve all this information. In mid-1943, a section of the Washington Navy Yard was converted into the Damage Analysis Laboratory. Here, recovered fragments from ships like Preston were stored in long drawers, labeled with tags that read Guadalcanal, November 1942, or Savo Island Destroyer Section. Forward boiler room. Engineers used microscopes to study how rivets had sheared, how welds had failed, and what temperatures had been reached during the fires. They mapped stress fractures like doctors tracing arteries. The findings were shared with shipyards across the country. Through thick bound reports stamped restricted, the reports made clear that the era of instinct-driven shipbuilding was over. No longer would the Navy rely solely on tradition or rule of thumb. The new destroyers would be products of evidence and experiment. What emerged from those pages was the first blueprint of what would become known as the post-Guadalcanal design philosophy, a fusion of engineering pragmatism and hard-won combat. Experience. As 1943 turned into 1944, these ideas began to shape the next great destroyer programs. The Allen M. Sumner class incorporated many of the lessons from the Mahan and Benson designs. Wider beams provided greater stability. Dual rudders improved maneuverability. Most importantly, machinery spaces were divided into separate watertight units, allowing a ship to limp home even after catastrophic damage to one section. Every new hull was a silent memorial to the old. But the influence of Guadalcanal went further than structural changes. It transformed how American engineers thought about innovation under pressure. Before the war, design cycles could stretch over a decade. Now, lessons were being integrated in months. Each battle fed data into a feedback loop of adaptation. This accelerated pace became the hallmark of U.S. naval engineering and would persist through the Cold War and beyond. In shipyards, workers noticed the difference. Older welders, who had spent their lives building merchant ships, found themselves adjusting to new standards. Blueprints arrived revised weekly, sometimes daily. Riveters cursed the engineers for changing hull patterns mid-construction, but most understood the reasons. Every modification, every thicker plate or altered bracket, carried the ghost of a sunken vessel behind it. For the engineers, The war offered an unprecedented field laboratory. When a new class went into action, observers followed its performance closely. After engagements, reports returned to Washington within weeks. The Navy began to view its fleet as a living organism, learning and evolving. The loss of one ship could mean the survival of many more. The human side of this transformation was captured in the correspondence between engineers and officers at sea. In one letter dated October 1943, a destroyer captain wrote from the Aleutians, "Tell your men in the Bureau that whatever they did to the hull seams worked. We took a near miss off the port quarter and not a drop came through." Such feedback confirmed that the sacrifices of the past year were yielding results. Meanwhile, deeper lessons were being drawn. The Navy began to study not only how ships broke, but why crews reacted as they did under stress. Psychologists and engineers collaborated to improve the layout of control rooms, reduce confusion in emergencies, and standardize signaling. Even the shape of watertight doors and the color coding of pipes were reconsidered. The modern concept of human factors engineering and naval design, how people interact with machines, was born from these wartime studies. Beyond the laboratories, the war carried on relentlessly. New destroyers rolled off production lines, larger and sturdier than those before them. Many of the men who had survived Preston's sinking served on these newer ships. They could sense the difference beneath their boots, the steadier roll, the thicker deck, the sound of doors that sealed more tightly. They understood that someone, somewhere, had been listening to what the sea had taught them. In the spring of 1944, as American forces pushed westward through the Central Pacific, the Navy tested its improved designs in combat at places like the Philippine Sea and Light Gulf. The results were undeniable. Ships that might once have been lost to a single torpedo now survived long enough to fight back. Fires still raged, but they spread more slowly. Compartments held longer, pumps worked better, crews had more time to act. The balance between speed and strength had shifted decisively toward survival. By war's end, more than 300 U.S. destroyers had been built or rebuilt under these evolving principles. Each was a composite of lessons learned from predecessors like Preston. Their design lineage stretched unbroken from the shallow waters of Guadalcanal to the docks of Yokosuka. After the war, the Bureau of Ships gathered its accumulated wartime data into a monumental series of technical volumes known as the Naval Damage Reports. They covered everything from hull deformation under blast load to the melting points of paint compounds. For decades, these volumes remained classified, circulated only within the Navy's engineering corps. When declassified in the 1960s, they revealed the scale of what had been learned and the quiet brilliance of the men who had turned disaster into design. Among those who contributed was Ensign Robert McHenry, the young survivor of Preston. By 1945, he had become a full naval architect and later worked on the first post-war destroyer classes. He often said that his education had begun not in the classroom, but in the South Pacific. "Every ship has a story," he wrote years later, "and the sea keeps score. We learned to listen, listening, more than anything, defined the new Navy. It listened to its sailors, to its engineers, and even to its failures. That humility became a kind of strength. It ensured that the ghosts of Guadalcanal would not fade into legend alone, but would shape the steel and spirit of every ship that followed." In the early 1950s, as the Cold War dawned, a new generation of destroyers slid into the water, sleek, radar-equipped, missile-capable. Their designs owed as much to physics as to memory. The engineers who built them often spoke of the war as if it were a continuing presence, an invisible advisor standing beside the drafting table. They had internalized its lessons so deeply that safety, redundancy, and structural integrity were no longer optional virtues, but central tenets of the profession. Decades later, when undersea exploration teams located the wreck of USS Preston using sonar imaging, they found her remarkably preserved. The bow lay upright, guns still trained toward the unseen enemy. Marine biologists noted how coral had filled the holes left by the shells. nature healing what war had torn. For naval historians, the images carried a different message. They could trace every line of design that had since evolved from that shape, every improvement written in the curves of newer hulls. The Preston, even in silence, was still teaching. The salvaged fragments that once sat in drawers at the Washington Navy Yard have long since been transferred to archives. Some are on display at the Naval History and Heritage Command. Small rusted relics with faded labels. Visitors rarely pause for long. The pieces are humble, unassuming, but for those who understand what they represent, they are more than artifacts. They are pages from the book of trial and error, chapters of a continuing story that began in smoke and fire and ended in innovation. The legacy of those studies reaches far beyond shipbuilding. The analytical methods developed to investigate wartime losses, systematic data collection, material testing, post-failure reconstruction became models for safety engineering across industries. The same principles that rebuilt the destroyer fleet eventually informed the design of aircraft, nuclear reactors, and even spacecraft. Each field carried a fragment of that wartime lesson, that failure, properly understood, is not an end but a beginning. For the U.S. Navy, that truth became doctrine. Every new design, every modernization, carries within it a trace of remembrance. The men who walk the decks of modern destroyers may never know the name Preston, but they stand on the work she inspired. Her fall transformed not only steel and rivets, but also the very culture of American engineering. A culture that values testing, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of improvement. As the tide of war receded and peace returned, shipyards that had once roared day and night fell quiet. Yet in the quiet, the hum of learning continued. Engineers reviewed wartime reports late into the 1950s, searching for patterns, refining theories, ensuring that no lesson would be forgotten. The ocean had been a cruel teacher, but it had taught well. From the salvage divers who first touched the broken hull, to the draftsmen who redrew the blueprints in Washington, to the builders who laid down the keels of the next generation, all shared a single conviction that out of destruction could come progress. It was a faith not born of optimism but of observation. The wrecks of the past were not monuments to failure. They were blueprints for the future. The story of the USS Preston, once a tragedy whispered among survivors, had become a chapter in a larger narrative, the rebirth of American naval design. Her loss had illuminated the hidden weaknesses of an entire fleet. Her wreckage had guided the hands that built the ships which followed. In that sense, she never truly sank. Her spirit lived on in steel, in calculations, in the quiet confidence of sailors who knew that their ship, whatever happened, would hold. The sea remembers, but so does the engineer. Between them, they ensured that what was lost in the depths would rise again, not as a ghost, but as a legacy of learning, a testament to the power of human ingenuity to transform disaster into design. By 1944, American shipbuilding had entered a new age. The massive lessons learned from the depths of Guadalcanal and the wreck of the Preston were now being applied on the slipways of Maine, California, and Virginia. The shipyards, once places of intuition and craft, had become laboratories of precision. Every plate, beam, and bracket reflected a question once raised by the sea and answered by an engineer. With a slide rule, the U.S. Navy no longer designed ships as though they were static creations. It designed them as evolving organism structures, capable of learning from the experience of their predecessors. This approach, born from the brutal clarity of wartime loss, was known informally among engineers as feedback design. It was a phrase never written into any official doctrine, but its philosophy came to define the post-war fleet. The first major test of this philosophy was the Allen M. Sumner class, where the Maine-class destroyers like Preston had been narrow, sleek, and fragile. The Sumner was broader and more balanced. Its hull beam was widened by over 2 feet, giving the ship greater stability and more space for internal compartmentalization. Each machinery room was now separated by reinforced bulkheads and redundant systems to independent fire mains to separate electrical generators. and duplicated control lines. A single hit could no longer paralyze the entire ship. For naval engineers, these were not just numbers on blueprints. They were answers to specific failures witnessed in battle. The thicker hull plating addressed shell penetrations that had doomed earlier ships. Improved longitudinal framing prevented the hull from twisting under blast pressure. Even the placement of ammunition lockers reflected detailed analysis of explosions aboard lost vessels. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing was left unstudied. The Sumner's design also introduced new thinking in hydrodynamics. Naval architects used data from captured Japanese reports and their own wartime tests to refine hull shapes for both speed and efficiency. The result was a destroyer that could turn tighter, roll less, and sustain high speed in rough water without breaking its back. Survivability and performance no longer existed in opposition. They were now partners in design. These lessons came at a cost, but they also unlocked an era of unprecedented creativity. The shipyards became crucibles of innovation, combining military urgency with scientific discipline. Engineers who had once worked on bridges, locomotives, or skyscrapers now turned their attention to destroyers. The Navy's partnership with universities deepened. Laboratories at MIT, Caltech, and the University of Michigan became extensions of the Bureau of Ships. Scale models of new hull designs were tested in long, narrow water tunnels, and their wake patterns recorded with cameras and dies. Every swirl of water was studied as though it were a clue from a crime scene, the crime being a ship's previous destruction. Metallurgy, too, advanced by leaps. The failures of lightweight steels used in early destroyers spurred a massive research effort into new alloys. The result was the development of HY series steels, high-yield materials capable of withstanding greater stress without deforming or fracturing. These metals would later find their way into submarines and, eventually, the hulls of missile cruisers and nuclear carriers. The path to those achievements began with wrecks like Preston, where ordinary steel had torn like paper under blast pressure. The lessons extended beyond physical materials. The very process of shipbuilding changed. Pre-war construction had often been linear, a hull laid down, fitted out, and then modified as needed. Now, shipyards adopted modular assembly. Sections were prefabricated in controlled environments, inspected for quality, and then joined together. The method increased efficiency, but also allowed engineers to apply design updates in real time. If a report from the Pacific indicated a weakness, that section could be re-engineered before it ever reached the slipway. This combination of speed and adaptability made American shipbuilding the envy of the world. By 1945, the United States could produce a fully equipped destroyer in under a year, a feat of industrial discipline unmatched in history. Yet even amid the roar of welding torches and hammering rivets, there was a growing sense of reflection. Every worker understood, at least in part, that their labor was building not just ships, but resilience. When the war finally ended in 1945, the shipyards fell silent once more. But for naval architects, the end of hostilities marked not a conclusion, but a beginning. The data gathered from wartime experiences, tens of thousands of pages of diagrams, photographs, and reports formed a treasure trove for post-war research. These documents were not filed away as relics. They were studied, annotated, and expanded upon for years. The Bureau of Ships understood that the peace that followed would not be permanent. The world had changed to profoundly. In 1946, as the Navy sought to maintain its edge, a new class of destroyers was conceived, the Gearing class. Though outwardly similar to the Sumner, the Gearing represented the maturity of the post-Guadalcanal design philosophy. It was longer, stronger, and capable of carrying more fuel for extended range. Its internal structure was optimized for damage control, new types of fire-resistant insulation, improved ventilation, and shock-mounted machinery. These ships were built not just for combat, but for endurance. It was here that the lessons from Preston and her sisters came fully into focus. The designers now thought of ships as systems rather than as singular constructions. They analyzed how power flowed through electrical circuits, how air circulated during fires, how shock waves traveled through decks. Everything was connected, and the integrity of the whole depended on the resilience of each part. The destroyer was no longer a mere fighting vessel. It had become a living network of systems engineered for survival. This systems-based approach paved the way for the Cold War fleet. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, many Gearing-class ships were called back into service. Their performance vindicated every wartime lesson. They withstood bomb blasts, collisions, and typhoons that would have crippled older designs. Crews reported fewer structural failures, fewer casualties from fires, and better control in emergencies. The improvements had not only saved ships, they had saved lives. Behind every success, however, remained a sense of humility. The Navy's post-war engineers were haunted by the understanding that every innovation had been paid for and lives lost. Their duty was not just to improve technology, but to honor sacrifice. Many of the men who had studied the Preston's remains or written her damage report continued to serve as mentors to younger engineers, ensuring that the memory of what had happened was never abstract. As the Cold War intensified, the Navy's focus shifted from surface gunnery to guided missiles, sonar, and nuclear propulsion. Yet even as destroyers became more complex, their design DNA still carried traces of the old lessons. Redundant systems, compartmentalized layouts, shock-resistant hulls, all could be traced back to the post-Guadalcanal transformation. The legacy of the Preston was, in essence, the birth of the modern U.S. Navy. The engineering mindset forged in the 1940s also changed how the Navy approached failure. No longer would a sunken ship be considered a closed chapter. Each loss, whether due to combat, accident, or design flaw, was immediately investigated with forensic rigor. The Naval Research Laboratory developed new underwater photography methods to document wrecks in situ. Salvage vessels were equipped with sonar and diving bells to recover evidence from depths once thought unreachable. In this way, the Navy institutionalized learning from failure, turning catastrophe into continuous improvement. By the late 1950s, the same principles were applied to entirely new fields. The first nuclear submarines, such as USS Nautilus, benefited directly from the high-yield steels and modular construction techniques pioneered after Preston. The compartmentalization philosophy became essential to submarine safety. The legacy extended upward as well into the air and into space. NASA's early engineers included many who had worked on naval projects during the war. Their approach to risk, redundancy, and structural testing owed much to the lessons learned from ships that had once gone down in the Pacific. The USS Preston herself remained on the seafloor near Guadalcanal, her twisted hull gradually becoming part of the coral landscape. Yet she was never forgotten. Naval historians frequently cited her in technical papers as one of the reference losses, a ship whose destruction revealed fundamental truths about destroyer design. In the annals of the Bureau of Ships, her name appeared not only in casualty lists but in engineering formulas, a symbol of progress born from tragedy. Even decades later, when sonar expeditions mapped her remains in the 1990s, analysts compared the wreck's configuration to wartime blueprints. They found that the structural failures corresponded exactly with the damage reports written in 1943, a validation of the engineers who had studied her from memory and fragments alone. Time had proven their accuracy, and their legacy lived on in every vessel that survived because of their work. The deeper lesson of the Preston and her generation was not merely about metal or machinery, but about mindset. American naval engineering had learned to think empirically, to trust data over tradition, evidence over assumption. It had learned that resilience was not a static attribute, but an evolving process. Every battle, every storm, every failure was another data point in the unending dialogue between ship and sea. That philosophy still endures. Modern destroyers like the Arleigh Burke class, equipped with advanced radar and missile systems, trace their lineage directly to those early lessons. Their steel may be new, their weapons futuristic, but their bones, the logic of their design, were written in the fires of Guadalcanal. Their watertight compartments, redundant power systems, and survivability features all descend from the same hard-earned wisdom that rose from the wreck of the Preston. To walk through one of these modern ships is to trace the invisible line of evolution from past to present. Beneath the hum of computers and the glow of control screens lies a continuity of thought, that the strength of a fleet is measured not in the number of ships afloat, but in its ability to learn from the ones that sank. The abyss that claimed the Preston was not an ending, it was a forge. Out of its dark pressure came a new light, the disciplined, data-driven ingenuity that would define American naval power for the rest of the century. The destroyer that perished at Guadalcanal had, in death, charted the course for a new era of design, a fleet built not on faith, but on understanding. And so, the lesson of the abyss is this: the sea does not forgive, but it does instruct. Those who listen to it, who study its wrecks and heed its warnings, emerge not unscarred but enlightened. The engineers who learned from Preston's fall ensured that her legacy would not lie buried in sand, but sail again in the form of ships that endured storms, wars, and time itself. Through them, through the craft they honed and the principles they forged, the U.S. Navy learned to build vessels that did not simply float, they endured. And endurance, more than victory, became the ultimate measure of mastery over the sea. When the war ended, the oceans were quieter but forever changed. Thousands of ships rested beneath the waves, and each one, to the Navy's mind, had a final mission to complete, to teach. The wreck of the USS Preston and others like her had become reference points, not just for remembrance but for redesign. The data collected from those lost hull stress charts, explosion analysis, fracture diagrams were the blueprints for the Navy's rebirth in the atomic age. As peace settled uneasily over the world, the U.S. Navy faced a new question: what would the next war look like? The enemy, if there was to be another, would not merely send torpedoes and shells. Technology was accelerating, and the ocean was becoming a domain of missiles, sonar shadows, and nuclear propulsion. The Navy could no longer think of ships as steel fortresses. It had to think of them as systems in an ecosystem of constant technological evolution. The Cold War was beginning. The destroyers that had survived World War II were rebuilt, refitted, and modernized. The Gearing-class ships, themselves descendants of the Preston's lineage, were the first to undergo massive technological transformation. Radar towers rose from their masts, sonar domes were bolted beneath their bows, and new electronics filled their compartments. They were still destroyers, but they had become something else, guardians of an invisible frontier. American naval engineers began to think less about how much armor could be added, and more about how fast a ship could detect, decide, and react. The lessons from Preston's sinking: structural integrity, redundancy, compartmentalization remained vital, but now they became the foundation for something larger: survivability through awareness. The sea would always be unforgiving, but information could now be its antidote. This was not a complete abandonment of steel and rivet thinking. It was an evolution of it. Engineers who had once studied the fractures of Guadalcanal now studied circuits, frequencies, and magnetic signatures. The Bureau of Ships merged with the Bureau of Ordnance to create a unified approach to ship systems, recognizing that hulls, weapons, and sensors could no longer be designed in isolation, that every innovation, sonar mapping, radar targeting, fire control computers, was built upon the wartime ethos: test, fail, learn. Refined out in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Navy undertook massive modernization programs known as Ship Characteristics Board (SCB) projects. While often associated with carriers, the same philosophy reshaped destroyers. The destroyers of the SCB era were not newly built, but reborn. Engineers stripped down aging hulls and rebuilt them with new systems, thicker decks, and stronger hull frames. It was as if the ghost of Preston watched from the dry deck as every bolt and bracket was reimagined. To withstand the pressures of the nuclear age, the changes went beyond materials. Engineers implemented what they had learned from wartime fire behavior: using new aluminum alloys that resisted corrosion but also required careful insulation against heat. Compartmentalization, once designed purely for watertight integrity, was now redefined to shield crews from radiation and chemical exposure. Each rebuild became an experiment in applied memory, proof that no lesson, however old, was obsolete. Then came the revolution that changed everything: guided missiles. The Navy's destroyers were now expected not only to fight ships and submarines, but to defend entire fleets from airborne threats. The introduction of surface-to-air missiles such as the RIN-Terrier and RIN-20 for Tartar in the late 1950s demanded new kinds of ships: faster, more stable, electrically complex. The destroyer became the testbed for integrating digital systems, radar tracking, and high-energy propulsion. This leap would have been impossible without the hard-earned wartime understanding of structure and stress. Missile launchers generated recoil forces rivaling those of major guns. The Navy's engineers applied the same data-driven design methods first used to study war damage: finite element stress analysis, shock testing, and vibration mapping. Each missile-capable destroyer carried within its bones the echoes of the Preston's broken beams, proof that strength and intelligence could coexist in steel. By the early 1960s, the Navy had created the first generation of guided missile destroyers, led by the Charles F. Adams class. They were sleek, electronic, and complex descendants not of the old gunnery destroyers, but of the lessons that came from wrecks studied to decades before. Where the Preston had succumbed to a single salvo, the Adams class could track, target, and intercept multiple threats at once. Each was a small floating laboratory, an embodiment of every hard-won truth of naval engineering. The Navy also learned something deeper: that no amount of technology could replace discipline and preparation. During the 1950s and 1960s, new training schools emerged for damage control programs designed to make sailors as adaptable as the ships they served on. Simulated compartments flooded with water or filled with smoke, challenging crews to seal leaks, reroute power, and maintain systems. The mindset of post-Guadalcanal engineering, learned from failure, was now embedded in human training itself. The results were transformative. When USS Preston suffered a catastrophic fire in 1967, the Navy's investigators traced both the causes and the heroism back to decades of accumulated knowledge. The ship's survival, though partial, validated many of the design changes and training doctrines first inspired by destroyers lost. In World War II, the system of feedback loss, study, improvement remained unbroken. The pursuit of endurance led to the next great leap in materials science. By the late 1960s, naval research labs began experimenting with composite materials, fiber-reinforced plastics, and lightweight alloys that could resist corrosion and heat far better than traditional steel. The Navy's metallurgists, descendants in spirit of those who once examined Preston's corroded plates, now worked with atomic microscopes and spectrographs. They traced the lineage of every new alloy back to the failures that had once cost ships their lives. They understood a principle that had been written in blood and fire during the 1940s: no material, no design, no innovation stands alone. Each improvement had to be tested not in theory but in reality. To this end, the Navy constructed the shock test facility in Dahlgren, Virginia, an enormous range where ships or models were exposed to simulated underwater explosions. Every vibration, every bolt displacement was measured. The spirit of Guadalcanal lived on there, transformed into data. The influence of American naval innovation did not remain confined to the United States. Allied navies, British, Canadian, Australian, Japanese, adopted similar design philosophies. Many sent observers to study American tests or license their designs. In Britain, the Type 42 destroyers borrowed heavily from the Gearing-class layout. Japan's post-war maritime self-defense force based its first destroyers on American hulls, incorporating modular compartmentalization and shock-proof design. Even the Soviet Union, through espionage and analysis, adapted Western survivability principles into its Cold War fleet. Thus, a ship that had sunk in the Pacific in 1940 to indirectly influenced naval design. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, the Preston's legacy had become global, a reminder that innovation often transcends borders, even those drawn by conflict. By the 1970s, the Navy's engineers spoke openly of their craft as a dialogue with the past. Each class of ship was a response to what had come before. Design was no longer an act of creation, it was an act of communication between generations of builders. In the spirit, the Navy began preserving not only blueprints but stories. Oral history projects captured the voices of shipbuilders, divers, and engineers who had worked on post-war reconstruction. Some of these interviews spoke of the Preston directly. One engineer recalled, "That ship taught us what the textbooks couldn't. We realized that strength isn't just thickness. It's about how everything connects, how it fails, how it heals." The same principle guided the creation of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the 1980s, a ship designed to absorb massive punishment and continue fighting. Every feature of the Burke, its angular hull, its double redundant systems, its radar-resistant silhouette, was an echo of lessons learned for decades earlier. When its lead ship entered service in 1991, naval architects quietly acknowledged that its true blueprint had been drafted. The night the Preston went down. In time, the lessons of naval engineering seeped into every corner of American industry. Airplane fuselages, space capsules, offshore oil platforms, all borrowed from the same mindset of failure analysis and redundant design. NASA's engineers studying Apollo 1's fire in 1967 used frameworks derived from Navy damage control manuals. The connection was not coincidental. Many of the same metallurgists, designers, and systems engineers who had rebuilt the destroyer fleet went on to design spacecraft and aircraft carriers alike. They carried with them the fundamental conviction that every failure, if studied honestly, becomes a seed of progress. Decades later, in the early 2000s, deep-sea exploration teams revisited the site of the USS Preston. The cameras descended through the clear blue water and revealed her as she had rested. For more than 60 years upright, silent, still recognizable. Coral had softened her lines, and fish darted through the holes once torn by shells. The explorers found that her structure had collapsed exactly along the same stress points noted by wartime engineers. It was confirmation not only of historical reports, but of the profound accuracy of the methods developed in the 1940s. The Preston had become both a memorial and a testament to the Navy's capacity to learn. When the expedition concluded, one of the researchers left a small plaque on the seabed near the wreck. It read simply, "From your loss came our strength." That inscription could have served as the motto for an entire generation of naval architects. From the ashes of war to the dawn of digital warfare, from the roar of boilers to the hum of microprocessors, the line of evolution remained unbroken. The DNA of the Preston, her design, her failure, her lesson ran through the veins of every ship that followed. Modern destroyers, powered by gas turbines and guided by satellites, still carry her influence in every weld and joint. They are faster, quieter, stronger, but their true inheritance lies not in technology, but in philosophy. Never stop learning. Never stop improving. Never forget. The ocean remains what it always was: beautiful, vast, indifferent. It humbles every engineer who tries to master it. But because of those who studied the wrecks of Guadalcanal, the Navy learned not to fight the sea, but to understand it. The USS Preston may rest in silence, but her story sails on in the wake of every destroyer that cuts across the horizon, in the hum of every engine that endures the storm, in the steady hands of every sailor who trusts that his ship will hold. The destroyer that died at Guadalcanal did not vanish. She evolved, through design, through memory, through the unending pursuit of perfection. She became the blueprint for the Navy's future and, in a greater sense, the blueprint for the resilience of humankind. In the quiet months following the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Pacific settled into an uneasy calm. The violence of November 1942 had left behind twisted hulks, sunken warships, and the ghosts of thousands of sailors. Yet amid that devastation, a new kind of mission began, not one of combat, but of discovery. From San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, naval engineers, metallurgists, and architects gathered in offices that still smelled of oil and salt water. They had one question: why had so many destroyers failed so catastrophically? The loss of the USS Preston, along with her sister ships Benham, Walk, and Monson, had shaken confidence in the very design philosophy of the U.S. fleet. Reports arrived from survivors who describe how shells from Japanese cruisers sliced through the thin hull plating, how fires raced unchecked through compartments, how a single hit could disable steering or power. Engineers took note of every detail. These first-hand accounts became case studies, raw data drawn from the edge of survival. At the same time, naval salvage operations were recovering fragments from the shallow waters near Guadalcanal. Steel plates, damaged turbines, twisted sections of superstructure, all sent back to American shipyards for study. For the first time in U.S. history, the Navy treated a lost warship not merely as a casualty, but as a teacher. In the laboratories of the Bureau of Ships, men in rolled-up sleeves and horn-rimmed glasses examined the Preston's recovered steel. Under magnifying lamps, they traced the fractures, measuring the angles where rivets had sheared clean through. Metallurgists found evidence of metal fatigue and brittle failure, suggesting the steel had been too stiff in cold waters, unable to flex under the stress of battle. On drawing boards across the country, designers began to rethink the destroyer itself. The pre-war idea had been speed-thin hulls, high horsepower, minimal weight. But Guadalcanal proved that speed alone could not save a ship in close combat. The Preston's fate showed that survivability, redundancy, armor integrity, and internal subdivision would define the next generation. From the ashes of loss emerged a new language of engineering. Detailed studies from the wreck led to a major internal report, Damage Analysis of Destroyers in Action, November 1942. It circulated quietly through the Navy's design offices. Inside were precise lessons drawn from the wreckage: the need for reinforced longitudinal framing, improved watertight compartmentalization, and stronger bulkhead welds. These may have seemed technical, even mundane, but they represented a philosophical shift. A destroyer was no longer just a fast escort. It had to be a survivor. As these reports took shape, shipyards in California and Maine became laboratories of reinvention. Engineers built scale models of the Preston's hull and tested them in wave tanks, observing how stress traveled through the ship's spine when struck by simulated explosions. They found that the old Mayan-class design, to which Preston belonged, distributed shock poorly. A hit amidships could ripple through the entire vessel like a steel whip. The findings were sobering, yet revolutionary. Meanwhile, in a quiet office at Bath Iron Works, naval architect Philip Spaulding examined the same diagrams. Spaulding and his colleagues began sketching what would become the Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, an answer to every weakness Guadalcanal had exposed. Wider beams for stability, deeper hulls for strength, twin rudders for maneuverability, and redesigned boiler rooms separated by stronger bulkheads to prevent catastrophic loss of power. Every innovation, every bolt and beam, owed something to the fallen ships of 1942. In the Pacific, divers continued their grim work. The waters off Savo Island became known as Ironbottom Sound, littered with the skeletons of more than 50 ships. Yet to engineers, it became a living museum. Years later, Navy divers revisiting the Preston's resting place would remark on how her wreck remained remarkably intact, a silent monument to both failure and endurance. In Washington, the Bureau of Ships quietly adopted a new doctrine called Design for Damage Control. It was no longer assumed that a ship would remain whole under fire. Instead, they built for the worst-case scenario: compartments isolated by steel doors, redundant power systems, improved firefighting lines, and ventilation that could be sealed instantly. This shift was not glamorous. It lacked the drama of sea battles or heroic rescues, but it saved lives and, in time, entire fleets. By early 1944, the lessons from the Preston and her lost sisters had reached the production floors. Welders worked with new alloys. Naval architects introduced curved hull plating to deflect blasts rather than absorb them. When the Gearing-class destroyers entered service in 1945, they carried thicker decks, improved radar systems, and reinforced command centers. They were faster and stronger machines built not only to fight, but to endure. The engineers often said that every Gearing launched was, in part, a tribute to the Preston. Through the meticulous study of destruction, America's naval builders found rebirth. Each rivet driven into new steel bore the echo of November 1942, when a single night of fire had forced a reckoning. The war would continue for 3 more brutal years, but by the time peace arrived, the philosophy of American shipbuilding had changed forever. In the years following Guadalcanal, the Navy's attention shifted from immediate survival to understanding. Every piece of steel, every damage report, every survivor's account became part of a larger equation. The U.S. Navy was determined that no destroyer would die in vain again. The war raged on across the Pacific, yet far from the front lines, in the cold echo of foundries and the hum of drafting rooms, a different kind of battle unfolded, a war against ignorance. Engineers and naval architects faced an enemy as complex as any fleet. The limits of their own understanding of ships at war. At the Naval Research Laboratory, teams of scientists studied how shockwaves traveled through a ship's structure when struck by shells or torpedoes. They used explosive charges in test tanks to observe how water transmitted pressure. What they found astonished them. A destroyer's thin plating, designed for agility, acted like a drum head under fire, amplifying shock instead of dispersing it. The Preston's hull had cracked, not only from direct impact, but from reverberating pressure waves that bounced through her frame. This revelation changed everything. It wasn't enough to make ships thicker. They had to be smarter. Materials had to absorb force, not merely resist it. Metallurgists experimented with new grades of high-tensile steel that could flex without fracturing, combining strength with ductility. In the great steel mills of Pennsylvania and Ohio, they refined alloys with precise ratios of nickel and chromium metals that would bend rather than shatter. These were not simple changes. Every adjustment in metal composition altered weight, buoyancy, and even the balance of a ship at sea. The destroyer had always been a delicate compromise, light enough to race, strong enough to fight. Now, engineers sought a third-quality resilience. Blueprints were redrawn. Longitudinal girders replaced some of the older transverse frames. Welded joints replaced rivets, eliminating weak points that had often failed under blast pressure. Welding itself had been controversial. Many old-timers distrusted it, but the evidence from the wrecks was clear. Rivets had torn loose. Welds, properly done, had held. The new destroyers would be fully welded, a choice that would define every U.S. warship to come. Meanwhile, hydrodynamicists at the David Taylor Model Basin in Maryland began testing new hull shapes. They found that a slightly fuller bow improved not only seakeeping, but also resistance to shock. The streamlined hulls of the pre-war years, designed to slice through the sea, were elegant but fragile. The new designs traded some beauty for survivability. As data accumulated, the Navy formalized its findings into a sweeping report, War Damage Experience. U.S. destroyers. Within its pages lay the distilled knowledge of Guadalcanal, thousands of observations, calculations, and diagrams. The report was more than an analysis. It was a manifesto for a new age of naval design. At the heart of it was a revelation about redundancy. On the Preston, a single shell had severed cables leading to the main director, blinding the gunnery crews. Another had ruptured the forward boiler room, leaving her dead in the water. From these failures came a new doctrine. No critical system would ever again depend on a single pathway. Cables would be routed through separated conduits. Power sources would be divided into isolated compartments. If one section fell silent, Another would speak. It was, in essence, the birth of distributed survivability, a principle that would guide warship design. Into the nuclear age, the changes extended beyond steel and circuitry. Training manuals for sailors were rewritten. Firefighting techniques were overhauled, with new emphasis on portable CO systems and chemical foams. Damage control became not an afterthought, but a discipline. In every destroyer school and fleet training center, recruits were taught to think like engineers, to understand the bones of their ship and how to keep her alive under fire. The ghost of the Preston lingered in every classroom. Her story became required reading in naval academies. Officers studied her blueprints and battle damage, tracing each shell impact, each failure, each desperate moment of decision. From tragedy came education. By 1945, as the war drew to a close, a new generation of destroyers was already taking shape on the slips. The Allen M. Sumner and Gearing classes embodied the lessons of Guadalcanal. Their hulls were wider and deeper, their decks reinforced, their internal systems doubled. They carried more anti-aircraft guns, more radar, more range, and more confidence. Yet, even as these ships sailed triumphantly at the end of World War II, the Navy's engineers were already thinking ahead. They knew that naval warfare would never stand still. Missiles were being tested in the deserts of New Mexico. Submarines were growing stealthier. The oceans themselves were becoming new theaters of technology. The wrecks at Ironbottom Sound had revealed not just how ships could die, but how knowledge could survive. Every battle scar, every fractured beam, every melted switch had something to teach. The Preston's death had seeded an evolution that would carry far beyond the Pacific. In the first years after the war, the lessons gathered from Guadalcanal were applied to new problems: longer deployments, heavier weapon systems, the strain of radar masts and sonar domes. Engineers learned to account for these new stresses in their structural calculations. The destroyer, once a lean hunter of submarines, became a multi-role vessel, part guardian, part scout, part strike platform. American shipbuilders embraced a new philosophy: adaptability. They no longer built ships for a single war, but for an unknown future. By 1948, ship design conferences often began with a phrase that summed up a decade of pain and progress. Remember Guadalcanal? It was both a warning and a creed. Out of the abyss, the Navy had found not despair but direction. When the war ended in 1945, the United States Navy stood unmatched. Its fleets covered the seas, its carriers ruled the skies, and its shipyards had produced more vessels in 4 years than some nations had built in a century. But amid that triumph, a quiet question began to echo in design offices and dockyards across America. What comes next? The destroyers that had survived the war were already veterans of a bygone era. Their decks bore the marks of battles fought with guns and torpedoes. Yet the next war, if it came, would not look the same. Technology was changing faster than anyone could have predicted. Radar had given ships eyes through fog and darkness. Sonar had given them ears beneath the sea. And somewhere in the deserts of the American Southwest, scientists were testing weapons that no ship had ever faced before: guided missiles. The wreck of the Preston had given engineers a new philosophy: build for endurance, not elegance. Now, that philosophy met a new demand: build for adaptability. In shipyards from Bath, Maine, to Pascagoula, Mississippi, blueprints for the next generation of destroyers began to take shape. The Gearing class, born from wartime lessons, became the backbone of a peacetime experiment. Their hulls were strong enough, their internal systems flexible enough, to be modified again and again. They were stretched, rebuilt, modernized. They became testbeds for a Navy reinventing itself. The Bureau of Ships, now working alongside the newly formed Office of Naval Research, launched a sweeping initiative to apply wartime knowledge to future construction. Metallurgists studied how hull steel had weathered years at sea. Electrical engineers mapped out new redundancies for radar and communications. Hydrodynamicists revisited the very shape of destroyer bows, experimenting with finer entries and flared decks to cut through heavy seas. While carrying new equipment, the shipbuilders, who had once studied fragments of the Preston, now sketched with confidence. They knew what had failed and why. In the late 1940s, the Navy approved the construction of a new destroyer-class sleeker, more powerful, and engineered for the atomic age. The Forrest Sherman class, named for the wartime admiral who had championed naval modernization, would embody everything learned since Guadalcanal. Their steel came from improved alloys tested under pressure and heat. Their decks were cleaner, their superstructures simplified for radar efficiency. Inside, every vital system was duplicated or isolated: dual generators, dual pumps, separated steering controls, and below the waterline, new sonar domes gave them a sense of presence that would have seemed impossible a decade before. Each Forrest Sherman was a declaration. The Navy would never again be caught unprepared. Across the Pacific, new challenges were rising. The Soviet Union was building submarines faster than any nation in history, their designs echoing German innovations from the last months of the war. Under the waves, the balance of power was shifting. For the U.S. Navy, the destroyer's role evolved once again from gunship to guardian. From hunter to shield. To meet this threat, engineers turned to technology. The post-warriors saw a revolution in electronics, cathode ray displays, analog computers, and automated fire control systems. The destroyer became not just a fighting ship, but a thinking one. At the Naval Ship Research and Development Center, engineers used early computers to simulate hull stresses and shock resistance. They applied the mathematical methods once used to study the Preston's wreck to predict how future ships would respond to underwater explosions. The equations, once born from tragedy, now shaped every weld and joint. Shipyards changed too. Gone were the hurried wartime builds when ships rolled off the ways every week. Now, each hull was a project of precision. Bath Iron Works, Ingalls Shipbuilding, and the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard all adopted modular construction techniques, assembling ships in sections, welding them together with millimeter precision. What began as lessons from destroyed hulls now guided the creation of stronger, more efficient vessels. The results were stunning. By the mid-1950s, the U.S. Navy fielded a fleet of destroyers unlike any before, fast, heavily armed, and capable of operating across the globe. Yet the engineers knew they were building on borrowed time. The sound of jet engines now filled the skies. Missiles could travel faster than any torpedo, higher than any shell. The next destroyer would need to fight enemies it could not yet see. And so began the most ambitious transformation. Yet the birth of the guided missile destroyer, using the Forrest Sherman hull as a foundation, naval architects began to experiment. They installed launch rails for the Terrier and Tartar missiles, reconfigured the decks, and added advanced radar domes. The Preston's descendants, ships born from her lessons, were now at the forefront of a new kind of warfare, one measured in radar pings and electronic signals rather than cannon fire. Even so, the old instincts remained. Every compartment was designed for containment, every bulkhead for endurance. Engineers spoke often of heritage design, the unseen lineage that connected each modern destroyer to the wrecks of 1942. In the quiet spaces between blueprints and briefing rooms, some of the older designers still kept framed photographs of the Preston and the men who had served on her. They saw in her not just a failure, but a foundation, a reminder that progress was written in the language of sacrifice. As the 1950s turned to the 1960s, American shipbuilding entered a golden age. Nuclear power came to the seas. Radar and sonar became as vital as gunfire. The destroyer, once a small, fast ship built to protect the fleet, had evolved into something greater, a self-contained network of sensors and weapons. A symbol of American innovation, afloat. And still, deep beneath the waves of Ironbottom Sound, the Preston remained. Her steel was rusting, her decks buried in silt, but her influence endured in every ship that cut through the world's oceans. From her shattered hull had come a blueprint for the future. Every new destroyer launched, every engine fired, every radar pulse sent into the night sky. owed something to that single moment of loss off Guadalcanal. The United States Navy had turned tragedy into technology, and from the ruins of war had built a fleet ready for the uncertain peace of the Cold War. By the dawn of the 1960s, America's shipyards stood as temples of progress. The clang of hammers had given way to the whine of welders. The scent of molten flux replaced the smell of oil and paint. In cavernous assembly halls, destroyers and cruisers took shape like colossal sculptures of steel. They were no longer just ships, they were systems. The engineers who had studied wreckage from Guadalcanal were now senior men, their hair gone gray, their slide rules worn smooth. Many still remembered the twisted fragments of the Preston laid out on wooden tables in 1943. They remembered the shock of seeing brittle fractures along her seams, the thinness of her bulkheads, the faces of survivors who spoke of fire and steel. Now they looked upon ships like the Charles F. Adams and the Kuntz, destroyers armed with guided missiles and digital fire control computers, and saw the tangible proof of how far the Navy had come. The Cold War had begun, and with it came a new kind of pressure, technological, psychological, existential. The enemy was no longer just across the sea, but potentially above it, in the air, or below it, under the dark expanse of the world's oceans. Every new advance by the Soviet fleet pushed American engineers to think faster, build smarter, and plan deeper. At Bath Iron Works, designers reimagined the destroyer's silhouette. Angular superstructures replaced rounded forms, reflecting radar rather than catching it. Aluminum and high-tensile steel created lighter but stronger masts, capable of carrying immense radar rays. Beneath the waterline, new sonar domes and bulbous bows cut through the sea with refined precision. But the most dramatic change was invisible: the fusion of computation and command. Where once sailors shouted bearings across wind-whipped decks, computers now translated radar echoes into firing solutions in seconds. The ship had become an extension of its own technology, a living circuit of men and machines. The Navy called it combat information centralization. Sailors called it magic. From this new thinking came the Aegis concept, an integrated defense system capable of detecting, tracking, and intercepting multiple threats simultaneously. Its roots lay in the same philosophy that had arisen after the Preston's fall: redundancy, resilience, adaptability. Aegis was not a single invention, but a synthesis: radar, computers, software, and design bound together into one coherent system. Every line of its development echoed the lessons of the past, that a ship's true strength lay in its ability to survive the unexpected. At the same time, the Navy ventured into the uncharted realm of nuclear propulsion. The USS Nautilus had already proven the potential of nuclear submarines. Surface ships soon followed with experiments that would culminate in the nuclear-powered cruiser Long Beach. Though not a destroyer, the Long Beach represented the same engineering spirit that had guided naval innovation since Guadalcanal, building vessels not bound by old limitations. In the design halls, engineers spoke a new language. Terms like shock hardening, redundant load path, and resilient mountings became part of everyday discussion. Computers ran endless simulations of underwater explosions, hull flexure, and electronic interference. Each line of code, each calculation, was part of the same pursuit: to ensure that no single failure, mechanical, electrical, or structural, could ever again doom an American warship. The Preston's ghost had become a principle. In the late 1960s, the United States Navy introduced the Spruance class, a destroyer unlike any before it. Sleek, modular, and built for long-range anti-submarine warfare, it was the embodiment of flexibility. Its hull was designed using advanced hydrodynamic modeling. Its engines were gas turbines, lighter, cleaner, and easier to maintain than steam. Every system inside could be upgraded without redesigning the entire ship, a concept that came directly from decades of studying how earlier vessels had become obsolete too quickly. This was not a destroyer built for one battle, but for an evolving future. As these new ships entered service, the veterans of World War II watched with quiet pride. Some of them visited the commissioning ceremonies, their metals glinting in the sunlight. They listened to speeches about innovation, strength, and progress, and though few said it aloud, many thought of the ships that had gone down in Ironbottom Sound. They thought of the Preston. In her loss, they saw the spark that had ignited an entire era of advancement. The 1970s brought still greater leaps: digital fire control, advanced sonar, and computer-assisted navigation. Destroyers became floating laboratories of technology. Naval architects collaborated with scientists from MIT, Johns Hopkins, and the Naval Postgraduate School to refine sensors, weapons, and ship architecture. For the first time, the Navy began to view its fleet as a continuous organism, ships connected by data and doctrine rather than just formation lines. And yet, amid all the complexity, the core philosophy remained beautifully simple: build ships that can survive the worst. That mindset, born from the wreckage of a single destroyer, shaped not only America's fleet, but its very approach to technology. It taught engineers to fail forward, to learn from catastrophe rather than fear it. Every mishap, every structural test, every system failure was logged, studied, and transformed into an improvement. By the 1980s, when the first Arleigh Burke-class destroyer was conceived, the lineage was unmistakable. Her hull form combined the strength of wartime steel with the stealth of modern science. Her Aegis system fused radar, computer, and missile into a seamless defense. Her crew compartments were built with triple redundancy in power and air systems. The Burke class was not just another warship, it was the culmination of half a century of evolution that began the night the Preston went down, when the first Arleigh Burke launched in 1989. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison remarked that she carries the soul of every destroyer that came before her. Few realized how literally true that was. Inside her steel, her circuits, and her doctrine lived the memory of men who had once fought and fallen in Ironbottom Sound. From a single wreck came an entire lineage of innovation, spanning decades and oceans. The Solomon Sea is quiet now. Where once it thundered with fire, it now glitters under a Pacific sun. Below the waves lies Ironbottom Sound, a graveyard and a cradle. The sea holds the bones of ships and men who met their fate in that furious chapter of history. And among them, still resting in the silt and coral, is the USS Preston DD-379. Divers who visit her wreck describe a sense of stillness, not sorrow. Her hull, split and buried, has become home to schools of fish and coral gardens. Her nameplate, once sharp and proud, is softened by time. Yet when they shine their lights across the twisted steel, something unmistakable remains: the outline of a destroyer that gave her life before her time. For decades, ocean currents have carried fragments of her hull across the seabed, scattering them like seeds. And in a way, they were. The Preston's destruction was not an ending, it was a beginning. From her wreckage came the study that reshaped how America built ships. Every lesson drawn from her scars was passed down, generation after generation. From engineer to apprentice, from drawing board to shipyard floor, her failures became formulas. Her pain became progress. In every modern destroyer that cuts through the sea today, from the Arleigh Burke to the Zumwalt, there's a trace of the Preston. Not in metal, but in mindset, in the quiet insistence that nothing is wasted, that every loss must teach, that perfection is forged in reflection. In the design rooms of Pascagoula and Bath, the engineers still speak of the lineage of lessons. They don't name it after one ship, but they know where it began. They see it every time they run a stress analysis on a new hull form, or test a composite armor panel, or rewire a redundant circuit. The philosophy of rebirth through disaster, once a response to wartime tragedy, has become the very DNA of the Navy's innovation. When the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers first entered the fleet, some of the old World War II veterans were invited aboard. Among them were a handful of men who had fought at Guadalcanal. They walked the deck slowly, running their hands along the cool, gray steel. One of them paused by the forward gun and whispered, she would have loved to see this. And maybe, somewhere deep beneath those saying waters, the Preston heard, because this was her legacy, not a monument carved in stone, but one that moves, breathes, and sails today. Destroyers glide across every ocean, carrying systems so advanced that a single ship can defend an entire fleet. But behind every radar pulse, every missile intercept, every heartbeat of the modern Navy, there's an invisible echo of rivets hammered in the 1930s, of men who built without knowing how far their work would reach, of sailors who fell believing they were simply doing their duty. They were right. The future they fought for arrived, built on the bones of their courage. Every time a destroyer's engine hums to life and her bow cleaves the water, the story continues. Every course correction, every system upgrade, every idea born from failure carries the same unbroken thread of ingenuity that began in tragedy and transformed into triumph. Ironbottom Sound remains silent, but the Navy it inspired never stopped moving forward. The Preston sleeps, but her blueprint sails on.